There's a theory going around, and I must say it depresses me, that print is obsolete and that books are going out of style. Its proponent, of course, is Marshall McLuhan. I don't know, maybe he's right. We have an example right here in the case history of one product of the post-television era who was our most successful Canadian film producer.
It's the Pierre Burton Show, the program that comes to you from the major capitals of the world. This edition comes to you from Toronto. And Pierre's guest is Don Shebib, whose award-winning film, Going Down the Road, was on the 10 best list of several leading U.S. critics, and whose newest film, Rip Off, has just been released. And here's Pierre.
Well, Don Shebib is a child of television in the McLuhan age. I guess you can't remember. Can you remember a period when there wasn't a TV set?
Yeah, actually, I sort of came in at the, I was really 14 before we got our first television, and then it really sort of dominated my life to quite an extent after that.
Well, you have said publicly that you're totally educated by television. I find that difficult to believe.
I would, by the media, I think, because when I got out of high school, I must have been just about the dumbest kid in the world, even though I had, a fairly good academic record. And when I was 17 or 18, I started watching CBC, as opposed to just westerns and stuff. And I really got myself educated that way and on radio.
It's said that there's no educational television. Of course, all television, in a sense, is educational. Anything that shows you any corner of the world is an education.
Yeah, well, we've actually had educational television all along, and because the CBC is really half and half,
I think every television show there is, bad, good, or indifferent, does something to your mind. It opens it up in some way. My quarrel, I guess, with a lot of it, that it wastes a lot of its time not opening up your mind when it could do that and be entertaining as well. But is this true that you don't read books? That you?
No, I don't.
You don't?
The last time I read like a novel or a play or anything like that was Pride and Prejudice, which I had to read 15 years ago in grade 13.
You haven't read a book since Pride and Prejudice?
No.
That's a terrible one to stop with, if you ask me. Maybe that's why you stopped.
It was on the course.
It was never I'm not one of those who says Jane Austen was a very great writer, but I'm in the minority in that too. So you haven't. Why can't you read? Is it that you can't read or you don't read, or is it just a stubborn visual thing with you?
I guess it became almost a perceptual handicap after a while. I know by the time I got to the University of Toronto, I had to read textbooks, but I did as little of that as possible. It got to the point where I had to sit down and force myself to read by underlining every word with a pencil and ruler. I just look at the page and I just fell totally asleep.
Is this the result of being attuned to television, of being conditioned by the visual medium?
I really don't know. I read a lot when I was a kid, so it wasn't like I was a difficult reader when I was in grade 1 or something like that.
That's before you had TV, which you got when you were 14.
Right.
Well, what if somebody sends you a script? Can you read that?
I can, but I find it difficult to get all the way through it. It takes me a long time to read it.
And yet, you were quoted as saying that you'd like to make a film out of the Three Musketeers. How could you know about the Three Musketeers if you don't read?
Well, I read all the classic comics. That was my part.
Classic comics.
That was one of my big education things. I had collected them all when I was about 13 or 14, and that's how my only way I ever read any of the great novels, was through the classic comics.
You don't feel you've missed anything here, eh?
Well, I know I've missed a lot. Certainly, I've missed a lot. I do read a bit of history. History is one subject that fascinates me more than anything else, I guess. And that I can read. Fiction, I can't really get to more than 4 or 5 pages of any book without just absolutely falling asleep. I turn to the last page, I read that, and then that's it. I don't want to read anymore.
How about picture books? Can you read those, apart from comics?
Yeah, I'm a great, coffee table book person, like History of the Old West or Old Trains or things like that.
I'm delighted to hear somebody reads those. I've been involved in putting some out, and some callous publishers believe that coffee table books are merely furniture, that nobody actually reads them at all. But you do. At least you look at the pictures.
Well, the ones that interest me, yes, sure.
It's interesting in reading something about your background, what television seems to have done both to you and for you. It seems to have brought out many odd fascinations. A fascination with old movies, for instance, which are exclusive to television. A fascination with World War I and World War II. A fascination with old music and you collect old records and things. There's this enormous wave of nostalgia for the immediate past, which is sweeping over the country, is, I think, a product of old movies and television.
Yeah, I really got interested in movies because for some reason when I was about 15, I sort of got a tremendous attachment to the 20s and 30s. And for that reason, I started watching movies on. I would look in the TV guide every week, and if it said 1940, I wouldn't watch it. But if it was 1939, I'd turn it on and stay up no matter how late to watch it.
What was it either about the style of those films or the tenor of the times that got to you?
Well, I guess it was just the way they were always being romanticized. You know, the Roaring 20s and the aftermath in the 30s. I guess that they probably weren't anything like they've been made out to be. You know, but I just was always totally fascinated by it. I mean, I'm absolutely no interest at all in the 40s or the 50s. You know, which I thought were, you know.
Well, that's too close to you, maybe.
Perhaps, yes.
The 30s and 20s are fairly close to me, and I think I'm more fascinated by the previous century. I'm not sure, though. What kind of films in the 30s and 20s did you like? What were your favorites?
I really enjoyed the social films of the 30s.
The Capra film?
Yes, especially. And Fritz Lang, who did several really outstanding
Metropolis
films.
and...
Yeah, but in the 30s in Hollywood, he did Fury and You Only Live Once, and
these were the early gangster,
right.
Some of the early gangster films. As a filmmaker yourself, don't you find Capra overly sentimental in places and unbelievable? Is it?
Well, I think that I was really pleased to hear that when Capra was here about a couple of months ago, someone asked him what his best film was. And it's what I consider his best film, which is almost totally unknown film called It's a Wonderful Life, which is not a sentimental film at all. And it was made...
Jimmy Stewart, wasn't it?
Jimmy Stewart,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Marvelous film. That and the one about the fascists, Meet John Doe. I mean, they could hardly be considered sentimental. He's always judged by Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Mr. Deeds Comes to Town.
Well, or It Happened One Night.
Right.
But... how about the style of those films? They're not the style of your films at all, these 30s films. They move much more slowly. I think they're much more literate in the print sense than your films.
Mm-hmm.
They're much more logical in the progression of the story. They have much more of a beginning and a middle and end, I would say, than your films. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, of the later 30s, yeah. But I think some of the films in the early 30s were highly... divorced from literary material, you know, the gangster films in particular, and compared with the screwball comedies and all those lush, Emile Zola, all the Paul Muni things,
right.
Which were very, theatrical. I think in the early days of sound was an exceptionally exciting period of filmmaking, and it sort of settled down after about 1935,
Because I know that you have said that. A good many films today are far too literary in style. I'm thinking of, some of the big historical soap operas we've seen, like Richard Bolton and that kind of thing. While you concentrate much more on the visual image with a very light, thin script.
Well, actually, both of my features have been much too literate for my taste.
Really?
Yes. Yeah, much so. They relied far too heavily on the script in that sense. To me, the more you are burdened with a script and a story to tell, the more difficult it becomes to make a real piece of cinema. And the trick is to find some kind of, happy medium between the two. Because basically, free cinema is totally opposite to a film like Man of All Seasons or something like that, which is really a play.
No, well, it is a play, photographed. Of course, there's room for that, too, on the screen.
Right.
But it's interesting to hear you first talk about the Capra films, for instance, and then talk about this other kind of film, because it doesn't seem to me there's a meeting place there.
Well, I find Capra's films a straight and as literary as they are sometimes. They're
very literary. They depend on a very sophisticated script.
But
gags and
his appeal to me is just in, I think we are sort of, may perhaps see the world in somewhat similar fashion,
It's interesting that you are a man who's obviously interested in periods. You're interested in period baseball, I know. You're interested in early records, as I said. You're an old movie freak. Both the films that you've made have been totally contemporary. They've dealt with exactly what is happening now. If you use a terrible word and call them now films. Right. Has it occurred to you that you might like to make a period picture?
I would, but that takes a lot of money.
It's cheap. I see. You'd have to get the
Have
bankroll
to work up
behind
to
you.
that one, right?
What kind of a period picture would you make?
I really would like to make a picture about a baseball story at the turn of the century, which was...
Baseball at the turn of the century?
Mhm.
Why?
I find the characters who played the game then, and I'm certain that you could understand this, very fascinating, very similar to the sort of characters that you talked about in City of Gold, you know. It really was the end of the Old West. Most of the ball players there were surprisingly of German or Irish descent, you know, and rough breed and wild, strange. I'm much more fascinated by the 19th century than I am by the 20th. But
Oh, are you?
yes,
Even more fascinated by the 19th. Funny for somebody who's never read a book, how interested you are in history.
Mm-hmm.
This must again come from television, does it?
I was always interested in history from the time I was in grade school, very much.
But how can you be interested in history and not read it?
Well, you can
Don't
see
you read any history books?
You can see an enormous amount of history on television. I mean, look at the Michael Redgrave films of the Great War. You know.
Oh yeah, you can see quite a bit of it, but I don't know if you can see it all. There's an awful lot of history that you can't do very well visually. You can do a superficial thing visually.
Well, I must say my interest in history begins to wane a bit when it goes beyond behind or before the invention of the motion picture camera or the still camera.
So
When I see things painted, and I have to look at a bunch of Roman statues, and that's supposed to give me my impression of Rome, I mean, I don't know what that means at all, you know.
So you can't really be interested in any history before 1840, which is the daguerreotype invented the
Right. That's
camera
really
by
my most
1838,
interest,
didn't
yeah.
he? So it's ever since then. When was the motion picture camera invented? About 1895, 96 by Edison. So you don't care about the Greeks, the Romans, the Renaissance, or the cavemen?
No, I wouldn't say that, but I really don't find it as fascinating because I can't reach out and touch it as well as you can with the other stuff.
He told the New Yorker magazine reporter that he was McLuhan's child, and I think there's something in that. I'll be back in a moment to talk further with Don Shebib, the Canadian film producer, but first watch these commercials. I guess that Going Down the Road, certainly from a critical point of view, is the most successful Canadian non-fiction film ever made. It exploded in the United States. People like Judith Crist and many other reputable and respected critics put it on their best 10 list in the year in which it was produced. The man who made it, you will be interested to hear if you are parents, broke all the rules, never did any homework at school, was going to be a chemist, was a University of Toronto dropout, went to theological school, that turned him against religion. None of this education appeared to have been any use to him at all. He got most of it off the TV set, which some parents won't let their children watch at night, including from time to time this parent. Well, what are we? Are we doing everything wrong, we parents?
I don't know. I really couldn't answer that. I think that...
Well, you see, my family wouldn't let me read the Shadow magazine or Doc Savage when I was growing up, and I had to sneak it under the covers. But it may be that that helped my imagination more than some of the things I got at school. I don't know.
I think so. I remember there was a big fuss, 15, 20 years ago about the comics, which I thought was just, so silly,
Violence in comics? But that's what
yeah.
produced classic comics,
Right.
which had more violence on them than most comics, but classical violence, which is all right. But you never did homework at school. You said you were a lousy student when you got out of high school.
I got good marks, but high school didn't really tax me, And then when I got to university, I went to engineering, chemical engineering, and I really got nailed to the wall there because I had no work habits at all. And so I dropped out, and then I went back into arts, and then I started to buckle down a bit better.
How come St. Michael's, and why did you go there? And why did it turn you off religion?
I was born and raised a Roman Catholic, and it was really in my first year at St. Michael's that I just had it, that was when I really started through a lot of changes, Really when I started, probably when the media, had that much of an influence on me. I remember there was a long series on Darwin on the CBC that year, which I watched every night religiously, every Sunday night, and that was one of the things, and a geography course. Just being educated, really, which is the prime enemy of religion, in my belief, is education.
fascinating. It's CBC will be delighted to hear that their course on Darwin, which I remember very well, helped to turn you into a filmmaker, because now the CBC is showing the films of the man who watched Darwin on the CBC 10 or 15 years ago. Going down the road has been on the CBC. However, what was the link that led you? What got you into the films at all? You're obviously not going to be a filmmaker. You're taking chemistry of all things, and chemical engineering at that, which is about as far from a film, except the processing part, that you can get.
Right. Well, I had this fascination with the the period of the 20s and 30s, and then one day I found out that you could see even older films if you joined a film society. So I did that, and I started joining film societies. And just through the years I went to college, I really got interested in it. And
the older the film, the better, as far as you're concerned, huh?
At that point, yeah, which was certainly not true to think back on it now, but I really did feel that at the time.
You see all those classics they used to run in the films, The Love of Jeannie Nay, remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And M and Metropolis and The Last Laugh and all the Russian films.
I have a sort of a built-in collector's mind, and I sort of collect anything, and I would just sort of, you couldn't collect the films physically, but you could collect them in your head. Well, I saw that and I saw this, so I started really going to those things religiously.
Going back into the silent era, what impressed you? What films impressed you then?
I think more than any other film, Sunrise.
Was that Janet Gaynor and Charles
Gaynor.
Farrell?
No, that was Charles Farrell. That was in Seventh Heaven. But
Seventh Heaven.
George O'Brien. It was made
George
by
O'Brien. But half that film is good, if I remember. The other half was corned up by Hollywood.
It's corny, but it's real. I mean, Puccini is corn, but it's first class corn.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it was a beautiful film.
There's a scene which he tries to drown her, isn't there? In the lake, and the mist come up.
Yeah.
I remember that.
I just saw the film recently, about a year ago, and I thought it was just as great as I saw it when I was.
He went on to become a cowboy star in a.
Yeah, right.
Strange what happens to movies. What films do you like now, and what don't you like as a filmmaker? What influences are there on you, and what kind of film do you try to stay away from?
Well, you mean as a filmmaker, or
no, as a filmmaker who likes to go to the movies still. That's what I mean.
Well, I generally go to films based upon who directed them, and if I've been burnt by a particular director, at least I thought that films haven't interested me, I won't go see them anymore, no matter how much people say how they're great. Because even when they say that, I go back and see it, and it's still terrible. I really loved Romeo and Juliet. I thought it was a marvelous film that Zeffirelli made, and I like Arthur Penn's work. I think he's really a very
Bonnie
fine.
and Clyde. And
yes.
The other ones. What about John Ford?
I really love John Ford's films, but again, like with Capra, some of the ones that aren't really as highly praised as the other ones, like Wagon Master and My Darling Clementine, I think are his best works.
Dialogue to you, I think, is secondary to make a film, isn't it?
Well, there's dialogue and there's dialogue. There is dialogue that can be a little bit more, for want of a cliche word, cinematic than just straight. Plot is probably more so.
Plot is really secondary.
Right, yeah.
And yet, in the great days of the films that you like, the phrase that was used was Sam Golden's, who said, "It's all very pretty, but where is the story?" Sam Golden said, "Where is the story?" My criticism of a lot of films I've seen recently is that the films are beautiful, their technical effects are stunning, the scenery is pretty, but I keep waiting for this plot to begin. I keep waiting for something to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I actually keep waiting for John Wayne to walk in with both guns blazing in a couple of bad cowboy movies I've seen recently.
Well, but things can happen without it being in a plot. I mean, there can be dramatic tension not of a necessarily of a plot nature, like somebody's going to do this next week and that's going to set off a chain of events, sort of thing. Although, like, one of the films I saw recently that I really enjoyed a lot, and I only went to see it because it had come back, was the Wilder film on Sherlock Holmes, which was
Private Life of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, marvelous, charming
it.
film. I mean, his technique was just dreadful. It wasn't even a close-up of the whole film. Just straight camera work. But it was a really intelligently written thing and fascinating.
But I get the impression from watching a lot of the new films by younger filmmakers that they're so obsessed with technical innovation or technical trickery that they've forgotten about the audience. That you have these beautiful lap dissolves that go on forever and gorgeous jump cuts and everything else that we've learned to appreciate from television commercials, for instance. But this technique is surely not enough.
No.
Has this been your comment on some of them?
Well, there are some films that I've seen by particular filmmakers or whatever where some people sometimes innovate a certain technique.
Yeah.
But to be successful, there's always some truth or some feeling behind that technique. And a sort of secondary filmmaker will come along and use the technique without the basis of what it was really meant for behind it. And then they become gimmicky, like slow motion. I've got some slow motion in my film. I've been using slow motion for ever since the first film I made. It's if it's used and used right, it's not a gimmick. If it isn't, it's a cliche.
Yeah, because Orson Welles certainly used a lot of fresh techniques, or reasonably fresh techniques in Citizen Kane, but he had a heck of a good story running.
Sure. Oh, it was
the foreground of that, and used the techniques to further the story. You said you haven't been terribly satisfied with either of the films you've made, Ripoff or Going Down the Road.
No.
Has the Going Down the Road made you much money?
It's just about to now. It takes a long time for money to come in this kind of business.
It cost you only $84,000, which is an incredibly low sum to make a film of any stature on. And you mean to say the $84,000 is just now, after more than a year, coming back to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I've got that. I've paid that back. You see,
yeah.
So now it's about to start making a profit.
So from now on, everything might be gravy.
I hope so.
What has been the reaction to that film outside the large centers where people are used to modern, sophisticated film? Have there been places where they haven't taken to it at all?
Well, in Canada, it's been received very well everywhere. I don't know about the States. I don't know how it's gone, say, in the Bible Belt or down in the South, or in West Virginia, where people would really have a great deal of, in common with that story. It did very well in the Maritimes, for obvious reasons.
Sure.
Yeah.
It seemed to me, looking at that film, that it was a very Canadian film, not just that the backgrounds and the environment was totally recognizable, and not just that some of the Canadian institutions, such as the beer parlor, were totally recognizable, which certainly made it a Canadian film, but that to some extent the style was Canadian. It derived from the documentary style which we've always done best. Is there something in that?
Yeah, I think so. All my film training really came in the States at UCLA.
It's interesting because, to me, looking at this film, it had the Canadian stamp on it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean a film board stamp, but something akin to that, something that several other films made in this country have had.
I would hope that if I was ever to be a successful filmmaker, that if I went to Los Angeles and made a film there, it would have the American stamp on it. Or if I went to Britain, it would have a British feel to it. I think that's important. I really draw from things around me.
Yeah. No, I hope if you go somewhere else, it'll still have the Canadian stamp, as Italian films do, no matter where the director goes, and certainly Bergman's films do, no matter where he goes. Or maybe we'll just say it has the Don Shebib stamp on it. I'll be back in a moment. It's time for commercial. Don Shebib's now going to make some money, finally, from Going Down the Road, his first success. Will you use your own money in the next film, or will you use other people's?
Depends on what I'm going to do. I think I might like to do a couple of documentaries next before I do another feature. I want to take my time into that. So, I don't think I'm ever going to have enough money to really make a feature with.
I hope you have enough money to make the period baseball film. I thought that was a nutty idea when the show started, but now I think that I'd like to see it. Thanks for coming. Thanks for watching.
You've been watching Don Shebib on The Pierre Burton Show, a half-hour program of conversation, opinion, and debate. This is Bernard Cowan speaking.